It's Tony Shaffer, ex-Lieutenant Colonel, retired. Tony, thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. If I were to properly introduce you with all of your CV, it would take me the rest of the show. There's nothing that you haven't seen and nothing that you haven't done, some of which, if you told me about, you'd have to kill me, so I won't go there. I just want to ask you this question right off the bat.
Sure.
Tucker Carlson said today that a hot war was going to happen in the next year between the United States and Russia. Now, having seen Oppenheimer, I'm pretty damned anxious about that. Do you share Tucker's view on it?
So thank you for having me. It's good to be on your show. A lot of mutual friends wanted us to get together, so it's good we're here. And it's sad we have to talk about such a serious topic as our first issue. The answer is it's very likely. I put it at the 80% likelihood for three reasons. First, you have Vladimir Putin, who is not bluffing. He is doing what he believes is necessary to protect the Russian Empire, the Russian Republic. It is what it is. And George, the West, England and the United States in particular, don't seem to be listening to him. He's been very clear about what he's trying to achieve. And instead of accepting his perspective, because that you have to deal with his perspective, his perception. I'm a Reagan disciple. I know a lot of the Reagan folks. And Reagan was masterful in managing Russian perceptions and understanding them. We have no one who can do that. And therefore, my second point is miscalculation. You have Tony Blinken, you have Victoria Nuland, you have Joe Biden, who I don't believe for a minute understands what's going on around him, which means he's basically allowed for these other folks to run the thing. And Jake Sullivan is not competent. One of the reasons you've seen such horrendous mistakes in the so-called offensive in Ukraine, which is by all accounts failed. I've said it publicly. It has not worked. It's not going to work. Is that the West, the United States, leading NATO, continues to do things to only show weakness, to demonstrate weakness, and encourage Putin to think he can get away with things. So the issue is more about what does Putin want to do, because there's no leverage by NATO. And NATO is a boys' club at this point, George. You know, I've went to Warwick University back in 2016, lectured a little bit at their question time about what I saw coming out of Brexit. One of the things I said they should do is look at NATO to revitalize it. They've not revitalized anything in NATO over the past 6 years. They've made it weaker. And so a woke organization that has no ability to conduct its primary mission, which is defending NATO. They can't do it. And I think Putin understands this. So the more weakness the Biden administration shows, the more weakness NATO demonstrates on a daily basis, the more Putin may think he can get away with things. And my third and last point is that the border issues with Poland, with Latvia, Lithuania, all those issues are something that Putin, again, is not going to let go of. The Russians have been invaded. Let me go through this real quick. The Russians have been invaded by the Mongols in 2037, Ottoman Empire 1570, Sweden in 1708. They didn't even get the meatballs out of it. The French in 1812, Napoleon, Japan in 1905, the U.S. intervention, United States and our allies, 1918, and of course, a guy named Adolf Hitler in 1941. So inherently, the Russians have a paranoia. It is what it is. You have to accept it. It's their perception. And because, George, no one can understand their perspective, or no one's willing to listen to them, yeah, I think it's very possible that the West is going to continue to be tone deaf. There's going to be a miscalculation, and someone ends up in a nuclear exchange, which is my biggest concern at this point.
Mine too. Now, I was only a boy soldier. You were a very, very senior military officer, but we both know the old military adage, never reinforce failure. Or right. As my mother would put it, don't throw good money after bad. Right. That's exactly what we're doing, isn't it? Every time
Absolutely.
The Ukrainian so-called counteroffensive fails, we send more weapons and indeed more money into the mall. We've already, I think, established, and we agree, that Joe Biden is a Manchurian candidate, as Donald Trump calls him. Can't possibly be in charge. No military top brass would take an order from Joe Biden. You wouldn't send the old fella out for a loaf and expect him to come back with it and the right change. So
well, he'd have a loaf, but it would be in his depends. But that's
not having. Well, yeah, but why are we continuing to reinforce failure, continuing to throw good money after bad?
Two reasons for us. I can't speak to the British. I know the British are very much committed to supporting Ukraine in ways even more, I think, than the Americans. But two reasons. First, Leader McConnell from the Senate leaked it the other day. He was trying to defend the additional requests for money. Now, I'm a conservative, and yet he doesn't represent my values, because he admitted to something that I know is going on. He said, George, that most of that $113 billion earmarked for Ukraine is really going to be spent here in the United States. It's going to go to Raytheon, Boeing. It's going to go to all these big defense contractors. President Eisenhower warned us about this, and it's become true. The military-industrial congressional complex. So the reason that everybody's going along on both sides, Democrats, Republicans, is because everybody benefits. Everybody gets, bakshish out of this, and it's a lot of it. So people are benefiting, and I don't believe it's all blood money, because the people who are suffering from this spending is the Ukrainian people. They're caught in the middle. So that's one reason. Secondly, to your point, the Manchurian candidate, Ukraine bought Joe Biden. There's no doubt that most estimates put at $50 million the bribes that he received. Some of that's from Ukraine, not all of it. And so the more he fulfills his bribe, whatever, they sold Joe Biden, Joe's in, the more he can give to Ukraine, the more he fulfills what he was bribed to do. And beyond that, he took money from China. The more we can give Ukraine out of our wartime stocks, the less potential there is that we'll have any weapons available that are necessary for China. So it's a witch's brew, George, of bad. It's the defense industry profiting greatly from making all these weapons, and it's the political aspects of the left, our left, more than happy to sell the American Republic and our ethics and our beliefs down the road. They just don't care. So that's what I see happening. That's why you see this overwhelming and unrelenting spending right now from America on Ukraine.
Now, let me take you back. There may be areas that you don't want to talk about, but I have been myself a party to all of these conflicts. In the 1980s, I argued that the policy of my enemy's enemy is my friend was precisely the policy that done for Dr. Frankenstein, who discovered that he was making a monster. I argued that throughout the 80s, and indeed on the eve of the entry into Kabul by the so-called Mujahideen, I warned Mrs. Thatcher there in the Parliament that you have opened the gates to the barbarians, and a long dark night, I said, will now descend on the people of Afghanistan. And indeed, we punished the people of Afghanistan not once but twice. We punished them by putting these religious maniacs in power, and then we punished them for having these religious maniacs in power. And I wondered, with all your experience, vast experience in Afghanistan and indeed in other theaters, if you did not now agree with me, perhaps you always did, that supporting your enemy because he's the enemy, because he's the enemy of your enemy, is a profoundly bad idea.
It is. And I did not always agree with your position. I've come to this based on experience. I read while I was deployed to Afghanistan, George, a series of books called "The Bear Went Over the Mountain," and it talked about the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan and all their mistakes. And I was reading this like, oh, we'll never make these mistakes. Sure enough, we make all these mistakes. And not only that, to your point, the Mujahideen, the religious radicals, which have become more and more powerful, were again something we should never supported. Another book which I helped enlighten me was Charlie Wilson's War, a great book that outlines kind of how we got to the beginning of 9/11. And one of the grand ironies is my book, Operation Dark Heart, my first book, talks about us going into the safe havens to get these warlords. Well, we created those warlords, George. We were going after Hekmatyar, who left the back door open for bin Laden to escape back in 2001 when we were after him at Tora Bora. And then the Haqqani Network. The Haqqani Network was very effective in conducting operations all throughout Afghanistan during our time there. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to keep our troops safe. And ultimately, after the first year, after we decided to occupy, we were fine when we basically removed the Taliban. A lot of folks were happy that they were gone. And to your point, the idea should be let the Afghan people decide their future. I've never been for us giving them Karzai, giving them this constitution. You should allow for these people, they're self-governed. Most Afghanis, George, you probably know this, most Afghanis will never move more than 10 miles from the spot on earth they're born. And they can barely enumerate, and they're happy. They're happy. They don't want to be bothered with politics, but we inflicted upon them our political system, and by trying to push out the religious extreme. And here we are, 22 years later, and it's back to where it was. We might as well have just spent $1 trillion on, I don't know, marshmallows, because it would have had the same effect of all the spending, all the blood and treasure both of our countries provided in Afghanistan. I served alongside the Kiwi, the Australians, the British in combat, and this is not a blemish on anyone who served. People served based on their beliefs that they were doing the right thing. The problem is the policy, and I would argue most tragedies from 9/11 to this all result in bad policy at the political level, not at the intelligence level. So,
although the intelligence level has come into or under scrutiny of late, looming tower, I'm sure you've seen it.
I have.
Seems to chart a series of catastrophic mistakes. Let's call them mistakes. There are some who think it's worse than that. The left hand not knowing or even caring what the right hand is doing. So we have it all coming back to roost, if you like. We created the likes of bin Laden. We elevated him to heroic stature when he was fighting our enemy in the form of the Soviet Union. And then, just like Dr. Frankenstein, we discovered that a monster is a monster because we can no longer control it. And there they came, right, and they knocked down your biggest buildings, and they changed the face of your country and mine. Its security architecture, its legal architecture, its freedoms, its democracy were all disfigured by 9/11, which was a giant boomerang as far as I can see.
The effects of 9/11 have not resulted in positive outcomes. And one of the legacies that we're faced, two legacies, is the unending military spending, the AUMF, the authorized use of military force. George, I and others argued at the time this happened, we don't need special authorization. Just let us go do our jobs. We can do this without special authorities. We have the authorities, but they had to do this special thing. And I think it was a dodge for accountability. Now DOD can spend all sorts of money constantly, billions of dollars. We have the most expensive military ever, and yet I don't think it could fight. I don't think it could actually take on the French, if we had to take on the French, for example. It's not effective. So that's one a legacy that remains. The other thing is the Patriot Act. There's constant abuses here, and I can't speak for Britain. I suspect that GCHQ has done similar things, where they've been able to, the NSA, National Security Agency, and other intelligence agencies, to include especially our FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, has amazing authorities which do not require much in the way of review. They can go look at people's mail, they can intercept phone calls, they can go 2 or 3 levels down someone's phone tree if they so choose. And I don't believe there's been any benefit to increase the protection of the American people by having this. Nothing has been prevented, nothing's been deterred. Essentially, it's been an expansion of the Leviathan of the state to do this. And a little note on the intelligence thing. There's people like me, George, we just want to figure out what's going on. What happens is that once it gets past we operatives into that management level, that's where you see the mistakes made, because often the leaders at senior level, and I saw this with George Tenet, I've been in the room with George Tenet, I've been in the room with Mike Pompeo, I advised Mike, and people at that level are often trying to help facilitate the fulfillment of aspirations of political leaders. Tony Blair had this with the, people in the British intelligence community were saying, hey, these are bad ideas, don't do them. I said there was bad ideas. We warned about things, but we were overridden. So often the intelligence community becomes an extension of the political class, because if you can find someone who's malleable, like a Jim Clapper, a John Brennan, those guys are bureaucrats first and self-licking ice cream cones who are only worried about their career. So the careerists who rise to the top are more than happy to bend intelligence or lie for purposes of their own career advancement. That career advancement comes from being linked to the political class. The political class has either bad aspirations, bad desires, which are not in the interest of their country, or worse, or they just don't understand and they will direct someone to do something. The Afghanistan debacle 2 years ago for us, that was all forecast and preventable, but Joe Biden or whoever directed it did it anyway, and you saw the catastrophic results of that.
Yeah, and the families of those lost were recently
the 13
and justifiably very angry in front of the Congress. You have no idea how damning was your statement that the US Army couldn't defeat France. Is one of the reasons for that, well, when I look, I mean, I think I saw it on one of your publications, in lipstick and high heels, and the women are no different. The US Army has become almost a parody. You couldn't, at the time of MASH and so on, you couldn't depict that. If you had depicted in MASH that US Army top brass would be men dressed as women wearing lipstick and high heels, you couldn't make that up.
George, I think the idea of Mark Milley wearing a skirt and high heels is very appealing. I think there's a certain audience that appreciates Mark showing his true colors. But beyond that, no, it's like Monty Python. There's a great skit where Monty Python is having the marching about, and they decide not to march. That's kind of where we're at. It's like we have focused so much on skin color, who you sleep with. Do you want to become a boy or a girl from being the other? These are all the affectations which have become the foundation for today's our military. I don't know about yours, but I know ours. That's what the determining factor is. And so what has happened when you become focused on performing to a standard established by woke leaders, woke politicians, that's all you focus on. The Army's job, the Army I came into, was to kill people and break things. That's it. That's what the Army's supposed to do. It's not supposed to be a social petri dish, but that's what we've become. And so how this has happened, think about this. Your side too, and I know a lot of your generals. I've worked with some of your generals. We have had no victories over the past 20 years, nothing. The Desert Storm was our last win. And that's because Norman Schwarzkopf was a general who understood how to be a general and lead. We've had nothing since then. But yet, We have more generals than ever. We have more promotions, more medals, but we're not winning. That's because they have established within our system anyway, a system of measures of performance. So the performance standards are: did you support the LGBTQ agenda? Did you put high heels on and walk around with the troops? Those are the standards, and that are that you can perform against and get promoted and get medals. But when you look at, were you effective? Were you effective in achieving specific mission objectives? Did you take the hill? Did you protect Kabul? Did you stop the terrorists from blowing up these refugees? Nobody cares. There's no standard. Nobody got fired from Afghanistan. The only person who did get relieved is a lieutenant colonel named Stu Schiller. Colonel Schiller, I actually attended and testified at his court-martial. Here, I'm in North Carolina at Camp Lejeune. I testified on his behalf, saying essentially he was a whistleblower. He was trying to say, hey, we had incompetent leadership. These things happened and it could have been prevented. And George, he's the problem. He's the guy that gets fired for standing up and saying something's wrong. So that's the system we currently have in place. They worship mediocrity. If nothing else, Mark Milley is a mediocre officer who rose through the ranks because he was more politically astute than his peers. That's it. He's not a brilliant tactician. He talks to General Zaluzny, the leader of the Ukrainian effort, according to sources, on a daily basis. And we all see how that war is going.
Yes, quite. Now, finally, and I'm very grateful indeed for your time. I can't tell you how grateful.
It's good to be on with you. I appreciate it.
Thanks. The likelihood is, unless they put him in jail, unless he gets blown away, Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States. Last time he ran on the platform of draining the swamp, but he didn't drain the swamp. In fact, he plucked some of the prime specimens from the swamp, John Bolton, for example, and placed them right at his right hand, around the table with him. Would a second President Trump term be any different, do you think?
So I did an actual talk on this issue over the weekend down in Florida, and I talk about this all the time. And I get this question from my talks: Will he perform differently? The answer is he has to, or else he's doomed. I advised. I was on the transition team. My job, George, was to be the go-between between Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Joe Dunford, and Mark Milley, and Mike Flynn. I was working the transition issues there because I was working to advise the Pentagon at the time. And what I learned during that time is that Trump seemed to think of government as a business, like, hey, I acquired the government. It's my business now. And then I believe, I haven't talked to him about this, but I do believe Trump thought, oh, okay, I can delegate things down to people and they'll figure it out. And it's like a business. It wasn't like a business. And what he mistakenly did not defend Mike Flynn. I think that was a huge mistake. Mike knew where all the bodies were buried. I think he would have seen the Russia collusion narrative coming. That's why they had to get him out. And he appointed people like Rance Priebus. Rance Priebus saw me in the White House one time, George, and it was like he saw Satan himself. I mean, he was just pissed that I was there because I'm not establishment. I don't want to become part of it. I don't want to be in their club. And I've never hidden that. And the fact that I was there meeting to advise just visibly upset him. And it was Rance Priebus's, John Bolton's, General, what's his name? The guy that came in after Mike Flynn. I'll think of his name in a second. Huh?
Petraeus? No.
McMaster. All these folks came in to establish a path back. Now, one other quick note on this. I actually, during this time, wanted to do a full review. And after it was announced that Trump was spied on, George, I went to my folks. I said, look, we need to get into the FBI. I think the FBI is corrupt. I think they're using their foreign counterintelligence program as a domestic tool to go after political enemies. So let's go look at what they're doing. I proposed that we have a peer review. that we have Army intelligence, which Army does have parallel authorities within the United States, believe it or not, to do foreign counterintelligence. So I had selected, without them knowing, the people on this list never knew. I said, let's have this team go in and do an independent case review of all the FBI stuff. So I first go to talk to Mike Pompeo, and Mike says, I'm fine with that. It's probably wise. He was director of CIA at the time, but you got to go talk to John Kelly. John Kelly, who was chief of staff, who could authorize it. And he said, and so I go to the Pentagon next, and I talk to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Joe Dunford. I said, Joe, look, I think there's something more going on here. We should have Army come in and do a review of FBI. He says, I will support that, but the president's got to direct it because we DOD just can't go look at FBI stuff in DOJ. So I went to John Kelly, caught him at an event, and I explained to John Kelly, chief of staff of the White House of the president. I said, John, and I knew John. John runs in the Marine Corps in the Al Gray Mafia. I've advised them. I've been part of it for decades. And I said, look, John, we need to have the Army come in and do a review of the FBI. I need to talk to the president about getting authorization. You know what Kelly told me, George? He looked me square in the eye. He said, Tony, I am never going to allow you to talk to the president because all you're going to do is inflame his instincts. So,
well, his instincts were the right instincts.
Bingo.
That's for sure.
Yes. And so that's my point. Trump made the mistake of surrounding himself with people who were trying to isolate him, and he was isolated with very few exceptions. So he's got to have learned from that. And plus, he didn't appoint people at the operational level because in the end, his own Homeland Security service was working against him to suppress his ability or his supporters' ability to speak out in his support during the 2020 election. Think about that. His own federal government was working against him. So, and then the other thing, he never got control of spending. He never defunded the bureaucracy. You and I know, George, from your experience in Parliament, my experience dealing with all sorts of folks here, if you defund an organization, you take the wind out of their sails. He would not do it. He would not defund actual organizations within the government that were working against him. So if he has to have learned these lessons that we're talking about, because if he did not learn these lessons, he's going to end up, they're going to finally get him on something and put him in jail. Otherwise, he's got to get control of these things. He's got to stop this abuse. A lot of us have ideas on how to do it. And and I do believe he's going to win. But yes, George, he's got to learn from these mistakes and take a completely different course when he comes in if he really wants to drain the swamp, because he did not do it last time.